It is one of the least understood and most powerful alliances in modern history. A deal made behind closed doors in the mid 1970s reshaped the global economy, fueled decades of American dominance, and turned oil, black gold, into something almost divine. This was not just about energy, it was about faith. Not in God, but in the US dollar. The story of the petrodollar is the story of how America built an empire without colonies, an empire of contracts, oil wells, and bank ledgers. It is the story of how Washington learned to turn energy into obedience, and how a handful of men in Washington, Riyadh, and Wall Street rewired the financial system of the entire world. And even today, every time you fill your car or pay an energy bill, you are, in a very real sense, paying tribute to that empire. From gold to paper, the collapse that forced a reinvention. Let's begin with the year 1971. President Richard Nixon faced a crisis that could have ended America's financial dominance forever. For nearly 3 decades, the global economy had run on the Bretton Woods system, created in 1944, where the US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other major currency was pegged to the dollar. The system worked because the US had most of the world's gold reserves after World War II. But by the late 1960s, the math no longer worked. America was bleeding money through the Vietnam War, foreign aid, and domestic spending. There were more dollars circulating abroad than the US had gold to back them. Foreign governments, led by Charles de Gaulle's France, began demanding gold in exchange for their dollar holdings. Gold drained from US vaults at alarming speed. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went on television and did the unthinkable. He ended the dollar's convertibility to gold, closing the gold window. Overnight, the world's financial anchor vanished. The dollar was now a fiat currency, backed not by metal, but by trust. But that trust was evaporating fast. Inflation soared, oil prices rose, and countries began searching for alternatives to the dollar. For the first time in decades, the American empire trembled, not from bombs or enemies, but from economics. So Washington needed a new foundation for global faith, something as universal and indispensable as gold had once been. They found it in oil. The 1973 oil shock and the birth of a new order. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted between Israel and a coalition of Arab states. When the U.S. resupplied Israel, Arab members of OPEC, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, retaliated with an oil embargo. The price of crude quadrupled in months. Gas lines stretched for miles across America. Western economies reeled. But in chaos, there is opportunity. U.S. policymakers saw that oil, the most traded commodity on Earth, could replace gold as the new backbone of the financial system. All they needed was a way to make sure oil could only be bought in U.S. dollars. That's when a quiet diplomatic mission began, one that would change everything. The Secret Pact, Washington and Riyadh, 1974. In 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger traveled to Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. What they negotiated was nothing less than an economic revolution, a new kind of world order disguised as an energy partnership. The deal was simple but brilliant. 1. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. 2. The Saudis would reinvest their surplus oil revenues, their petrodollars, into U.S. government bonds and financial markets. 3. In return, the United States would provide military protection, weapons, and political support to the Saudi monarchy. It was sealed quietly, with no grand announcement, but it became the cornerstone of the petrodollar system. By 1975, all OPEC members had agreed to price their oil in dollars. From that point on, any country that needed oil, whether Japan, Germany, or India, first had to buy U.S. dollars. This created artificial demand for the American currency. Overnight, the dollar became indispensable again, not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by oil. The petrodollar loop, how the money came home. The genius of the petrodollar system was that it created a self-reinforcing financial loop. Here's how it worked. 1. Countries around the world needed oil, so they needed dollars. 2. To get dollars, they exported goods or borrowed from U.S. banks. 3. Oil producers like Saudi Arabia earned massive dollar surpluses. 4. Those petrodollars were then recycled back into U.S. banks and treasury bonds. This meant two extraordinary things happened simultaneously. The U.S. could run massive trade deficits, importing more than it exported, without devaluing its currency. The American government could issue unlimited debt because the world's oil trade guaranteed a constant flow of foreign capital into U.S. Treasury markets. Debt became America's greatest export. Oil became the world's most profitable religion. Every barrel sold was an act of faith. Faith in the dollar, faith in U.S. security guarantees, faith in a system no one dared challenge. The 1980s, petrodollar power and the rise of Wall Street. The petrodollar system didn't just save the dollar, it supercharged it. In the 1980s, U.S. banks like Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Morgan Stanley swam in recycled petrodollars. Oil-rich nations deposited billions, which banks then lent to developing countries in Latin America and Africa. The result was the Third World debt boom, followed by the 1982 debt crisis, when nations like Mexico defaulted on loans denominated in U.S. dollars. Washington's response was predictable. More loans, but under tighter conditions. Through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, the U.S. used dollar-denominated debt as leverage to enforce neoliberal reforms, privatization, austerity, open markets. It was financial colonialism by another name. The empire no longer needed armies. It had the bond market. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia grew rich beyond imagination. Its sovereign wealth flowed through Western banks, buying up stakes in corporations, real estate, and U.S. debt. The Saudis bought influence. The Americans sold protection. This was the unspoken trade. You keep the oil flowing, we keep your throne standing. War as a currency stabilizer. But there was another function of the petrodollar system, one more cynical and consistent. Whenever a nation threatened to break from it, war seemed to follow. In 2000, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin selling oil in euros, not dollars. By 2003, the U.S. had invaded Iraq, toppled his regime, and re-established dollar-based oil sales. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya proposed creating a gold-backed dinar for African oil trade, a move that could have undermined dollar dominance across the continent. That same year, NATO forces led by the U.S. bombed Libya into chaos. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the pattern is clear. The dollar's supremacy is not just economic. It is geopolitical. The petrodollar must be defended, not by gold reserves, but by military might. Every aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf is, in a sense, a floating central bank, enforcing a monetary order at gunpoint. The religion of oil. By the late 20th century, oil had become more than fuel. It was faith. Nations worshipped it with the same devotion once reserved for deities. Oil made modern life possible. Cars, plastics, agriculture, warfare. But the dollar made oil possible. The phrase, "In God we trust," printed on every dollar bill took on new meaning. For the global economy, that God was oil. Washington became the high priest. Riyadh became the temple. The rituals were the oil summits, the OPEC quotas, the quiet visits of U.S. presidents to Saudi palaces. The sermons were written not by theologians, but by economists. And the faithful? Every government on earth that needed oil to keep the lights on. The shadow of 2008, the petrodollar under strain. For decades, the petrodollar seemed unbreakable. But then came 2008, the global financial crisis. As Wall Street collapsed under its own greed, oil prices crashed from $147 a barrel to $40 in a few months. Petrodollar surpluses evaporated. OPEC nations began diversifying their investments. Meanwhile, the U.S. Federal Reserve began printing money on a scale never seen before, quantitative easing, to rescue its banks. The world began asking a dangerous question. If America can print infinite dollars, why should we treat them as valuable? At the same time, China's rise introduced a new rival system. Beijing began signing oil for yuan deals with Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. In 2018, China launched the Shanghai Petroleum Exchange, allowing oil to be traded in yuan backed by gold, the first serious alternative to the petrodollar since 1974. The cracks in the temple were starting to show. The 2020s. The great energy pivot. The petrodollar system thrived on oil demand. But what happens when the world starts shifting to renewables? The 2020s have brought new pressures. As climate policy accelerates and electric vehicles spread, oil's long-term dominance is no longer guaranteed. For the first time in half a century, the faith that bound the global economy, oil equals dollar, is faltering. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has begun diversifying. Through Vision 2030, the kingdom is investing in tech, tourism, and new energy, but it's also quietly exploring non-dollar oil sales. In 2022, Saudi Arabia and China discussed pricing some oil exports in yuan, a move unthinkable under the old U.S. alliance. At the same time, BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are building frameworks for cross-border payments outside the dollar system. Russia, sanctioned after invading Ukraine in 2022, began demanding payment for its oil and gas in rubles. The pillars of the petrodollar faith are trembling, but not yet falling. The loops of dependency. And yet, even as new systems rise, the old loops persist. Every time oil prices spike, demand for dollars surges. Every time U.S. debt climbs, oil exporters buy more treasuries. Every time a Middle Eastern crisis erupts, capital flees to U.S. markets for safety. The petrodollar is more than a policy. It's a psychological cycle. The world fears instability, and that fear sustains the dollar, the way believers cling tighter to faith in times of doubt. As long as oil remains priced in dollars, America retains what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing once called the exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the world's reserve currency without consequence. It's a privilege that allows Washington to finance trillion-dollar deficits, global wars, and domestic comfort, all paid for by the invisible tax of dollar demand. What happens when faith breaks? But no religion lasts forever. Every empire built on belief, Rome, Spain, Britain, eventually meets a crisis of faith. If oil ceases to be the universal commodity, or if major producers permanently abandon dollar pricing, the foundation of American economic power could crumble. The U.S. would no longer be able to export inflation, finance endless deficits, or weaponize the dollar through sanctions without blowback. That's why Washington defends the system so fiercely. Not just with policy, but with presence. American bases in the Middle East, drone fleets in the Gulf, and diplomatic leverage over OPEC all exist to preserve the dollar's role in the oil trade. The real battlefield isn't just in the desert, it's in the denomination. The new religion rising. Still, a new faith is forming. Digital currencies, decentralized finance, and alternative alliances like BRICS are creating what some call the post-petrodollar world. In 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it was open to accepting non-dollar payments for oil. Russia and China conducted more than $200 billion in trade settled in local currencies. Even France completed its first LNG purchase in yuan that same year. These are tremors before the quake. For 50 years, the petrodollar has been the altar at which the world's economy worshipped. But the congregation is restless. The rituals are changing. The priests are aging. The question isn't whether the petrodollar will end, it's how. Slowly, through diversification and digitalization, or suddenly through crisis and collapse. The final reflection. The faith we don't see, oil gave the dollar life. The dollar gave America power, and power once gained rarely lets go easily. For half a century, the petrodollar has been the invisible religion of the modern world, a creed built not on theology, but on necessity. Every nation believed because they had to. Every barrel of oil sold in dollars was a prayer that the system would hold another day. But faith built on fear never lasts. When the world finally finds the courage or the crisis to price oil in something else, the spell will break. And when that day comes, America will face what every empire eventually faces, the moment when belief runs out. Until then, every gas pump, every treasury auction, every military base in the Gulf is part of the same liturgy, the daily mass of the petrodollar faith. If this gave you a new lens on how energy became the lifeblood of empire, subscribe. Because the story of the petrodollar isn't over. The oil wells may dry up, but the religion of money and the quest to control it never does.